Have you ever wondered why a single, simple word has the power to redirect the entire course of a woman's life? The word is small, almost fragile on the tongue, yet in the psyche it is a tectonic force. In Jungian terms, it is the moment the ego stops negotiating with the shadow of pleasing, the animus projection withdraws, and a woman steps into the long corridor of her individuation. It begins quietly, often in a moment so ordinary that no one else notices. A woman finally says no. For years, sometimes decades, her life may have been shaped by the archetype of the caregiver, the nurturer, the one who gives even as she is depleted. She may have served lovers who did not value her, friends who mistook her softness for availability, workplaces that exploited her diligence. Outwardly, she moved with grace. Inwardly, a slow erosion took place. Stoic philosophy calls this erosion self-abandonment, the silent betrayal that happens when a person places external harmony above inner truth. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that a person's worth is measured by the things they allow to occupy their mind. For many women, the mind becomes occupied by the hope that saying yes will prevent disappointment, anger, or rejection. But beneath this surface compliance, the shadow waits. Jung described the shadow not as something dark to fear, but as the hidden reservoir of strength, instinct, and unclaimed authority. The woman who suppresses her boundaries is not weak. She is simply divided. Her conscious self wants peace. Her unconscious self demands authenticity. And eventually, the psyche cannot live in that tension forever. It often begins with a subtle internal whisper. Enough. Women do not hear this whisper with their ears. They feel it in the body. In the tightening of the chest when someone asks for something they do not wish to give. In the way their stomach knots when they agree simply to avoid conflict. In the exhaustion that lingers long after the favor has been done. These are the messages of the somatic unconscious, the deeper self urging transformation. Some women ignore these signals, continuing to play roles crafted by childhood conditioning, roles that rewarded compliance, gentleness, and the avoidance of disapproval. But others, slowly and courageously, begin to turn inward. This turning inward is the start of individuation. It is the moment a woman stops living in response to external expectations and begins living in alignment with the truth rising from within. This transformation is not dramatic at first. It is quiet, internal, and deeply psychological. The woman begins to observe her own patterns. The way she softens her voice when disagreeing, the way her heart races when she anticipates disappointing someone, the way her hands tremble slightly whenever she wants to set a boundary but cannot bring herself to do it. These observations are not signs of weakness. They are signs of awakening. When she finally says no, something ancient stirs inside her. Jung believed that every choice that aligns with one's inner self awakens the archetype of the self, the organizing, guiding principle of the psyche. The word no becomes more than refusal. It becomes a declaration of sovereignty. A woman finds herself standing on the border between who she has been and who she is becoming. Some people around her will not understand. They might react with confusion or resentment, as if her boundaries are an act of rebellion rather than an act of self-respect. This is projection, the moment others cast their own fears, insecurities, and unmet needs onto her. But saying no brings clarity. It reveals who truly valued her and who only valued her compliance. In the mythological realm, this moment resembles Persephone's ascent from the underworld. She does not rise unchanged. She rises initiated. Saying no initiates a woman into a new relationship with power, not the loud, forceful power that dominates, but the irresistible, quiet power that radiates from a person who knows her value. And you, listening now, may sense something familiar in this journey. Perhaps you, too, have felt the tremor of a boundary unspoken. Perhaps you have watched yourself agree, even when every cell in your body whispered against it. Perhaps you have felt the subtle grief of abandoning yourself for the comfort of someone else. But the psyche remembers, the body remembers, the soul remembers, and the moment a woman finally chooses truth over approval, something within her clicks into alignment. That is when others begin to notice, not because she becomes harsh, but because she becomes unmistakably grounded, clear, and unshakable. This is the irresistible power of women who say no, the power of a soul returning to itself. Some women discover the power of no only after life has pushed them to the edge of themselves. It often happens in moments that appear small from the outside but feel seismic within. A friend asks for another favor, though she is already overwhelmed. A partner expects emotional labor without offering emotional presence. A colleague assumes she will take on the extra burden because she always does. She feels the familiar tightening in her chest, the habitual impulse to smile, nod, and comply. Yet something in her, something ancient and long silenced, rises from the depths. Jung described the unconscious as a vast ocean beneath the small island of consciousness. When a woman begins to reclaim her boundaries, the waters beneath her begin to stir, carrying forgotten fragments of strength and intuition back to the surface. She feels them before she understands them. The instinct to say no is not rebellion. It is memory. It is the psyche remembering the truth of who she was before she learned to shrink herself. At first, she might resist this rising force. Saying no feels dangerous, as if she is risking connection, affection, or safety. She remembers moments earlier in life when expressing a boundary meant being labeled difficult, ungrateful, or selfish. Many women carry childhood imprints where love was conditional upon compliance. Some were taught that being good meant being agreeable, quiet, and endlessly accommodating. So when the desire to say no emerges, it doesn't arrive alone. It brings with it fear, guilt, and the echo of old emotional wounds. Yet this discomfort is part of the transformation. Jung called this confrontation with old inner patterns the meeting with the shadow. The shadow contains every suppressed emotion. The anger that was denied, the sadness that was dismissed, the instincts that were shamed. For many women, the shadow also carries the power they were never allowed to express. When she says no for the first time, she is not only resisting an external request. She is reaching into the shadow and retrieving a piece of herself. Modern trauma studies reveal that people who have lived too long in self-sacrifice often experience a disconnection from their own desires. They become hyper-attuned to the needs of others while losing touch with their own inner signals. This is not weakness. It is survival. But survival is not the same as living. When a woman begins to reclaim her no, she reconnects with sensation, intuition, desire. She begins to feel life from the inside rather than navigating it through constant adaptation. Picture her in a quiet moment after setting a boundary, her heart racing, hands trembling slightly. She fears she may have ruined a relationship or invited conflict. But in that same moment, something else appears, a pulse of relief, a breath that reaches deeper into the lungs than she has felt in years. A subtle, almost imperceptible sense of coming home. This internal shift is the soul recognizing itself. In archetypal terms, this is the emergence of the warrior feminine, not aggressive but clear, not rigid but self-possessed. The warrior feminine does not seek conflict. She seeks truth. She understands that saying no is not an act of rejection but an act of alignment. She learns that the people meant to walk with her will adapt to her boundaries or reveal themselves by stepping away. You may know this moment intimately. It is the moment you stood at the crossroads between pleasing others and honoring yourself. The moment you realized that the cost of constant yes was your own well-being. The moment you whispered no, not outwardly, perhaps, but inwardly, to the endless cycle of self-abandonment. That whisper was the beginning of everything. There is a profound psychological shift that happens when someone begins honoring their internal boundaries. The ego, once stretched thin from accommodating others, becomes strengthened. The nervous system, long strained by overwhelm, begins to settle. The animus, the inner masculine force that governs direction, discipline, and sovereignty, begins to awaken. Jung believed that when a woman integrates her animus, she stops looking outward for validation and begins to stand firmly within her own authority. This inner authority is what makes her presence irresistible. Not in a seductive or manipulative way, but in the way authenticity naturally draws respect. When she says no, she does not justify, apologize, or shrink. She does not over-explain. Her no becomes a reflection of self-knowledge. And nothing is more compelling than a person who knows who she is and what she will no longer tolerate. Others may push back at first. People who benefited from her lack of boundaries will resist her transformation. But those who truly value her will adapt, grow, and even admire her rising strength. Seneca once wrote that the person who respects themselves is respected by others. It is not a negotiation, it is a natural law of human behavior. And so, the woman continues on her journey, discovering that every no she speaks opens a new space in her life. Space for rest, space for self-trust, space for relationships rooted in balance rather than sacrifice. Each no becomes a doorway to individuation, the slow, profound process of becoming whole. Some women begin to realize that every no they speak does more than protect them. It reshapes their entire psychological landscape. Something subtle but undeniable changes in the atmosphere around them. The people who once assumed her compliance now pause before asking for more. The partner who once relied on her emotional endurance now senses that the old patterns have dissolved. Even her own inner critic, the voice shaped by years of external expectations, starts to lose its authority. This shift is not accidental. It is the natural result of an inner system reorganizing itself around truth rather than fear. In Jungian psychology, this moment reflects a crucial stage in individuation: the withdrawal of projection. When a woman says no, she stops projecting her desire for harmony onto people who do not honor her. She stops projecting strength onto others while believing she must remain soft. She stops projecting authority onto partners, mentors, or friends while diminishing her own. Slowly, she reclaims these qualities as internal realities rather than external dependencies. The people around her feel this shift even before she consciously recognizes it. There is a deep archetypal reason for this transformation. In the collective unconscious, the feminine is not merely nurturing. It is also protective, intuitive, and sovereign. The myths of ancient civilizations depict goddesses who do not apologize for their boundaries. Artemis refusing to be claimed, Athena defending her wisdom, Kali destroying everything that threatens her integrity. These figures live inside every woman, not as violent forces but as psychological potentials. When a woman says no, she awakens these archetypes. She becomes a living reminder that the feminine is not defined by sacrifice but by self-possession. But this awakening is not always comfortable. In fact, it often brings a period of emotional turbulence. She may feel guilt rise like a tide. She may sense old wounds resurfacing. She may find herself questioning whether she is allowed to protect her peace. This internal conflict is a sign of healing, not regression. Trauma wires the brain to anticipate danger in places where none exists. Saying no activates the old fear of punishment. Fear learned in childhood when boundaries were met with disapproval, anger, or withdrawal. Stoic philosophy offers a powerful counterbalance. Epictetus taught that the only true freedom lies in control over one's own mind, not in controlling the reactions of others. A woman reclaiming her boundaries begins to understand this in her bones. She realizes she cannot prevent disappointment or anger in others. She can only act in accordance with her values. And this realization becomes a form of emotional liberation. Slowly, she learns to sit with the discomfort that arises after saying no. She lets it pass through her rather than using compliance to escape it. This builds psychological resilience. Each time she endures the guilt without surrendering to it, the psyche rewires itself. Neuroscience and depth psychology converge here. Repeated experiences of self-protection teach the nervous system that boundaries are safe, even natural. And then something remarkable happens. After enough repetitions, her no longer feels like rebellion. It feels like equilibrium. She begins to speak it with calm clarity rather than tension. She stops bracing for backlash. She stops apologizing. She stops explaining. The energy of her no changes from defensive to embodied. People feel this difference. A no spoken with inner certainty requires fewer words, fewer justifications, fewer performances. It becomes a simple expression of truth. You may know this shift yourself. The moment your boundary no longer shakes your voice, the moment you feel grounded instead of guilty, the moment your entire body responds with quiet alignment. This is the moment the psyche integrates what Jung called the self, the full, centered, unified inner being. When the self becomes active, a person no longer negotiates against their own well-being. They no longer seek permission to exist. There is an unexpected gift that emerges during this process. Clarity. A woman begins to notice who supports her growth and who resists it. She sees which relationships thrive with boundaries and which crumble under their weight. She recognizes the difference between love and dependency, between respect and convenience. This clarity, while sometimes painful, is ultimately liberating. It frees her from illusions that kept her stuck. It opens doors to connections rooted in mutual honor rather than silent trade-offs. And with this clarity comes confidence. Not the loud, performative confidence that demands validation, but the quiet, steady confidence of a woman who trusts herself. She no longer rushes to prove her worth. She no longer fights for spaces that do not welcome her. She no longer overextends herself to maintain relationships that take more than they give. Her no becomes a compass, guiding her toward authenticity and away from self-betrayal. This is the stage when her presence begins to shift. She walks differently. She speaks differently. She chooses differently. Others may not know exactly what changed, but they feel it. They feel the difference between a woman who fears rejection and a woman who fears losing herself. The latter is magnetic, not because she seeks attention, but because she embodies a rare emotional sovereignty that cannot be imitated. And so the journey deepens, pulling her toward something even more profound. For the woman who learns to say no inevitably discovers an even greater power waiting on the horizon. The power to choose herself without hesitation. Most women spend years believing that choosing themselves is an act of selfishness. It is a message absorbed quietly, implicitly, through culture, family dynamics, and relationships that rewarded self-denial. But as a woman deepens her relationship with the word no, she begins to encounter a profound truth. Choosing herself is not selfish. It is sacred. Each boundary she establishes becomes a bridge reconnecting her to her inner world, the world she abandoned long ago in exchange for perceived approval. In Jungian language, this is the long-awaited reconciliation between the ego and the deeper self, the authentic center of the psyche. As she walks further into this transformation, something subtle but revolutionary begins to unfold. She notices that her emotional reactions change. The situations that once triggered panic now evoke curiosity. The guilt that once overwhelmed her now appears as a passing sensation, observed rather than obeyed. The anxiety that once swelled in her chest when she disappointed someone loses its power. She is no longer driven by the unconscious need to maintain harmony at any cost. Instead, she begins to live from a grounded center that feels timeless, as though it existed long before her conditioning ever began. This groundedness is not merely psychological, it is archetypal. Deep in the collective unconscious lies the image of the sovereign woman, the one who stands firm in her truth, unshaken by the opinions of others. She is not cold, nor is she detached. She is simply rooted in her own being. When a woman says no from this place, she is not pushing people away. She is protecting the integrity of her inner kingdom. The people who value her feel this strength and respond with respect. Those who sought to benefit from her lack of boundaries find themselves exposed, no longer shielded by her endless generosity. There is an important shift that takes place in her relationships during this stage. People start revealing who they truly are in response to her boundaries. Some grow with her, meeting her at her new level of clarity. They adjust, they listen, they evolve. These relationships deepen, becoming more honest and reciprocal. But others resist, criticize, or withdraw. They were never attached to her, they were attached to her compliance. When they can no longer access her in that familiar way, their interest fades. This loss, though painful, is essential. Jung taught that individuation requires letting go of the personas and attachments that no longer serve the evolving psyche. She cannot step into her wholeness while holding on to relationships built on self-erasure. And yet, even in this shedding, she finds a strange sense of peace. Something inside her knows that this is the price of freedom. Stoic philosophy echoes this truth. What is truly yours cannot be taken, and what can be taken was never truly yours. The woman who embraces this wisdom stops chasing, explaining, and negotiating for her place in someone's life. She understands that her worth is not transactional. Her no becomes the filter through which genuine connection is revealed. As she continues to honor her boundaries, another profound transformation emerges. She begins to trust herself. This is not ordinary trust. It is deep, instinctual trust. She trusts her intuition, recognizing it as a form of inner intelligence rather than a source of confusion. She trusts her emotions, understanding that they are messages rather than weaknesses. She trusts her body, which warns her when something is off, even before her conscious mind understands why. She trusts her timing, no longer forcing what does not flow. This trust strengthens her from within, creating a sense of safety that no external validation could ever provide. You may feel this shift within yourself, the sense that you no longer need to ask for permission to exist, the feeling that your boundaries are not demands but natural expressions of your inner truth, the awareness that saying no longer pulls you into fear but into alignment. This is the moment when the psyche, once fragmented, begins to unify. Jung would say that the woman is no longer living from the ego alone. She is being guided by the self, the inner compass that points toward wholeness. And this wholeness becomes unmistakable. It shapes her posture, her voice, her presence. She speaks less but with more impact. She offers care freely but without self-abandonment. She listens deeply but without absorbing what does not belong to her. She becomes selective not out of superiority, but out of wisdom. Her life becomes intentional. Her relationships become meaningful. Her decisions become aligned with her deeper values. Others may describe her as mysterious, magnetic, or even intimidating. But the truth is simple. She has stopped betraying herself. And there is nothing more powerful or more uncommon than a woman who refuses to abandon her inner world for the comfort of others. This stage of the journey reveals yet another hidden truth. No is not just a boundary. It is a doorway. Each no she speaks frees her from the invisible chains of expectation. It frees her from emotional labor that was never hers to carry. It frees her from patterns that kept her small. And most importantly, it frees her to say yes to the life that is truly hers. There comes a moment in a woman's evolution when the journey of saying no shifts from an act of defense to an act of creation. In the beginning, boundaries feel like walls, fortresses built to keep out what once harmed her. But as she travels deeper into her own psyche, she begins to realize that boundaries are not walls at all. They are doors. They are choices. They are the architecture of an inner life rebuilt from truth rather than fear. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she begins to step into the most liberating stage of all. The stage where saying no allows her to make room for a new yes. This yes is not loud or impulsive. It is not born from obligation, anxiety, or the desire to be approved. Instead, it rises steadily from within, shaped by intuition, clarity, and emotional sovereignty. Jung called this the emergence of the self, an inner guide that reveals the path of individuation. When the self becomes active, the woman no longer moves through life unconsciously. She chooses what aligns with her inner truth and releases what does not. Her no becomes a form of refinement, carving away what drains her, while her yes becomes an invitation to purpose, creativity, and peace. For many women, this stage brings an unexpected and profound stillness. The nervous system, once conditioned to anticipate conflict or disappointment, finally begins to rest. The chronic vigilance that guided her decisions softens. Her body, which once braced for the emotional cost of every boundary, begins to feel safe in her own presence. A gentle spaciousness opens within her, a space she has not felt since childhood. This is what happens when the psyche reclaims what was lost. Energy returns, clarity sharpens, self-respect becomes second nature. In this stillness, she begins to see herself with new eyes, not as someone who must earn love through sacrifice, but as someone inherently worthy of consideration. She notices how her relationships evolve when she shows up with boundaries. She sees who thrives in this new dynamic and who fades away. And instead of clinging to what is leaving, she lets go, gracefully, consciously, without bitterness. This letting go is not a loss. It is an initiation, because something else begins to rise in the space left behind, her authentic self. This authenticity carries a quiet strength. It is not performative, not loud, not dramatic. It is steady and grounded, like an ancient tree rooted deeply into the earth. She becomes the kind of woman who does not chase, because she knows that what is meant for her cannot be resisted. She becomes the kind of woman who does not negotiate her worth, because she understands that worth is not something another person can grant or remove. She becomes the kind of woman who no longer fears solitude, because solitude is no longer emptiness. It is sacred space. You may recognize the shift within yourself. The moment you stopped abandoning your needs, the moment you no longer apologized for your boundaries, the moment you began to make choices that honored your inner life. It is the moment you felt a quiet certainty that you no longer needed to be everything for everyone, that you did not need to explain your no, that you did not need to justify your desires, that simply being aligned with your own truth was enough. In this stage, women often notice increased intuition, an ability to sense when something resonates and when something does not. This intuition is the integration of the anima, the inner feminine archetype associated with emotion, creativity, and insight. Once suppressed by constant compliance, it now emerges with clarity. Decisions become easier. Red flags become visible. Opportunities become recognizable. She no longer confuses intensity with intimacy or demands with devotion. Her inner world has become her compass. This transformation also heals something deeper, the wound of self-abandonment. For years, she may have betrayed her own needs to keep the peace or preserve relationships. But now her inner child, the part of her that was silenced, overlooked, or minimized, finally feels protected. When she says no, that child feels seen. When she sets limits, that child feels safe. When she chooses herself, that child feels loved. And with this healing, a new emotional landscape emerges, one built on self-compassion rather than self-criticism. As the psyche heals, it creates room for what Jung called the union of opposites, the integration of strength and softness, boundaries and openness, independence and connection. She no longer swings between extremes. She no longer gives too much or guards too tightly. She becomes balanced, whole, and inwardly anchored. From this wholeness arises a life that feels entirely different. A life where relationships are chosen consciously. A life where her time and energy are treated with reverence. A life where peace is no longer something she waits for, it is something she builds. A life where her yes is powerful because her no is respected. And so, the journey that began with the trembling voice of a single no ends with something profound. A woman who has returned to herself. A woman who stands unshaken, no longer living to satisfy the expectations of others. A woman who radiates a quiet magnetism born not from performance, but from presence. A woman who understands that saying no is not resistance, it is rebirth. And in this rebirth, she discovers the deepest truth of all, that a life lived in alignment with the soul is the greatest freedom a human being can ever know. Thank you for spending this time with us. Your journey gives life to this channel. Stay with us, and together we'll keep exploring, growing, and discovering the truths that shape the soul. Until the next video, take care and see you soon.